What's up, everybody? For those of you who don't know, I'm Adam. This is CattleDogGarage&Racing. I'm going to start by saying that you're not going to want to miss this entire video, because this video is hands down the most in-depth camshaft, valve event timing, and optimal engine performance video on the internet to date, even compared to my last two cam videos. This video contains rare, or dare I say even secret, empirical knowledge in many forms that you literally will not find anywhere else but here. There are high-level professionals out there that have dedicated their entire lives to the pursuit of the secrets surrounding the dynamics of valve event timing and high-performance engines that haven't accumulated the level of knowledge you will find in this video. And that is not an overinflated claim or bragging. That is unbiased empirical fact within the actual reality we live in. All the knowledge in this video is empirical and backed by independent dyno data and more in-depth explanations and more information than you will find anywhere else in one place on the internet, guaranteed. I also personally have the first proof of a supersonic phenomenon that is not known to exist and is said by many top professionals and some physicists to be impossible. So stick around through this entire video and you will be amongst the first to see and know the truth about its existence and how I was able to achieve the production of said phenomenon. Trying to sum up what's going to be going on in this rare knowledge-packed video, I'm going to be explaining and showing with Dyno Data, a dyno-proven, race-winning and empirical method of valve event timing / camshaft selection, starting by placing the intake valve opening position, intake valve close position, and overlap placement in the optimal position, then focusing on a specific amount of overlap, duration, overlap triangle symmetry or asymmetry, exhaust valve closing position, and exhaust valve opening position. Any of the very top professionals would agree that the intake valve opening position and the intake valve close position are two of the most important and influential valve events that affect the power and the characteristics of your engine, followed by the exhaust valve close position and the exhaust valve opening position. If your intake valve opening position, intake valve close position, and overlap placement are in the wrong location, you will fail to achieve the full torque and horsepower potential across the entire RPM range that a given cubic inch engine combination was capable of achieving. Now conversely, if the intake valve opening position, intake valve close position, and overlap placement are in the optimal location, you are set to produce the most potential pound-feet per cubic inch and horsepower per cubic inch across the entire RPM range that a given cubic inch engine combination was set up to produce. This basically secret, rather controversial, and not well understood information I'm sharing will produce dyno-proven and race-winning torque and horsepower increases across the entire curve that are not known to exist by many and are actually considered impossible by an extremely vast majority of the high-performance industry and the automotive industry. The power increases across the entire RPM range are not known to exist by more than 99% of the general population. A little later in this video, I will also be exposing more rare, basically secret information to the internet that you won't find anywhere else but here, that you don't want to miss. It will be in the form of a visual representation via a graph that displays the pressure dynamics and gas dynamics of a well-spec'd and tuned, naturally aspirated V8 race engine producing well over 120% volumetric efficiency. With the pressure dynamics graph, we will go over the dynamics of refractive waveform pulses and pressures in the intake and exhaust in relation to absolute pressure, cylinder pressure, pressure differentials, the intake valve opening position, overlap, exhaust valve close position, intake valve close position, exhaust valve opening position, and the degrees of crankshaft rotation, along with how the refractive waveform pulses in the intake and exhaust work together with the valve events to create the inertial ramming effect, pressure differentials, and increases in velocity, kinetic energy, and dynamic inertia, all of which dynamically contribute to the inertial ramming effect and inertial column supercharging, which, due to the ideal placement of the intake valve opening position, exhaust valve close position, intake valve close position, and the exhaust valve opening position, can produce up to 8 to 15 psi-G in the cylinder of a naturally aspirated 2-valve V8 race engine upon intake valve close position. Essentially, the ideally placed intake valve opening position, exhaust valve close position, and exhaust valve opening position are enabling the ideally placed intake valve close position to take advantage of an optimally filled cylinder, essentially turning a naturally aspirated V8 race engine into a dynamic inertia forced induction engine. So stick around through this entire video because you're bound to learn something at literally any given second. Now let's start here with something to think about. Have you ever considered calling a few different cam companies to get their opinion on speccing a cam to get the most out of any given cubic inch engine combination for a given application? Then anonymously call or have a friend call those same cam companies once every week or so for a month or two and ask for a same cam recommendation for the same application and RPM range. I can about guarantee 8 to 9 times out of 10 you will get a different camshaft for the same application and RPM range. But the question is, are any one of those 10 camshafts going to be optimal or extremely close to optimal for that application? If you're looking to get the most out of a given cubic inch engine combination, you can about guarantee they absolutely will not be close to optimal or even near close to optimal. Now, whether the naturally aspirated conventional headed V8 engine combination without variable valve timing you're speccing a camshaft for is a budget street engine or a no expense spared purpose built all out race engine with the highest potential trapped volumetric efficiency in mind, whatever the application or intended use, be it a drag car, pickup truck, dually, daily driven street car, bog truck, pull truck, or for super stock racing, off-road racing, circle track, rock crawling, etc. Whatever cubic inch engine, intended RPM range, or intended use, whether you're just assembling a basic engine or actually building high performance, high horsepower race engines, this video will provide you with rare, fundamental empirical knowledge backed by data to help you begin to select an optimal or near optimal camshaft every time and achieve max potential trapped volumetric efficiency along with max torque and horsepower production across the entire RPM range. Now, as we begin to dive into this, let's think about a few things right quick. The first thing to think about is what about a camshaft or valve events dictates an engine's potential to produce torque and horsepower at any given point in the RPM range, or what's known as how fat the power curve is, and also has the potential to increase trapped volumetric efficiency across the entire RPM range when optimally selected. The next thing to think about is what about a camshaft or valve events dictates the effective operating RPM range of an engine, yet can also hurt volumetric efficiency when placed in the inoptimal location, or when too much is added in the wrong way or in the wrong location. Both of these questions will be answered in a minute. Today we are going to be taking a deeper dive into a few specific areas of rare empirical knowledge within the actual reality we live in. We will be doing this in a form of a lesson in what I'm going to be calling the empirical reality of optimal valve event timing. More specifically, the most influential but least understood aspects of camshafts and the optimal timing of the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, degrees of overlap, exhaust valve closed position, intake valve closed position, and the exhaust valve open position, along with dyno proof of the rarely known effect or phenomenon that is produced across the entire RPM range when all the valve events are optimal, among many other rarely talked about subjects. Now, I know from past experience that a lot of you open-minded or truly intelligent individuals enjoy a good dose of empirical reality or true knowledge. And I also know from past experience that empirical reality in many aspects tends to hurt some feelings. And most of the time that's due to individuals having a blind affliction of cognitive bias, lack of comprehension of what I'm saying, the inability to follow a storyline, lack of attention span, etc. But these issues lie solely within themselves, and that's just fine because in the reality we live in, some people get into their feelings really easy for many different reasons, especially when they can't begin to wrap their head around the fact that they can't comprehend that they don't know what they don't know, and in turn, they truly have no idea and don't fully comprehend what they're trying to talk about. So if reality hurts your feelings, just consider this a fair warning because throughout this video, shit's about to get real in more ways than you could probably fathom. So with that being said, here's a little disclaimer of a sort. If you decide to watch this video and your feelings get hurt from empirical, quantitative, and qualitative reality, that issue lies solely within yourself and is not my issue, so don't complain in the comments because nobody made you watch this, and you sure ain't paying to see this, so just keep that in mind. Now on the other hand, if you're one of the truly open-minded or intelligent individuals without the attention span of a gnat, and you aren't blindly plagued by a cognitively biased affliction that you're oblivious to, and you're actively seeking rare, top-level knowledge that's backed by physics, proven by Dyno research, first-place trophy, championship wins, along with being personally approved by the likes of Mr. David Vizard and many other very intelligent individuals, then you have come to the right place. I've been told by a few very intelligent, highly qualified subscribers that the information and the knowledge I presented in my last 2 cam videos would have made for a good PhD dissertation. A few others have said that I provided them with a more complete knowledge of valve events, which brought about a more thorough understanding of valve event timing. They went on to say that I taught them more about valve events, optimal valve events, and lobe separation angle than Billy Godbold's newest book. If you don't know who Billy Godbold is, Billy is a nuclear physicist, and he was the lead cam designer / profile dynamics engineer for comp cams for something like 30 years. He is also involved in Pro Stock, NASCAR, etc. Billy is easily within the top 10 in valve events. Now this is no disrespect at all to Billy Godbold, because I have absolutely nothing but the utmost respect for him. But what I had been told by these subscribers is just a reality they've experienced from seeing my last video. He had told me Billy didn't go into great detail where he should have. Dude also said he personally felt he wasted his money on the book. I haven't personally read Billy's book, but Billy is a very intelligent individual with a lot of experience, so I actually recommend checking out Billy Godbold's book, even if you're on the more advanced side. It's always good to see others' data and understand their perceptions on specific subjects. Now, I've also had 2 other highly educated, intelligent, and very experienced subscribers who are ex-NASCAR engine builders tell me that my videos had provided them with a deeper, more complete understanding of optimal valve event timing than a 2-day paid seminar from one of the top-level, legendary type individuals in the high-performance industry, who is an ex-aerospace engineer that has taught valve event timing at university level, among many other things. I won't elaborate further out of respect for the man and the information he provides in those seminars. This is just simply another example of the reality people have experienced, then decided to share with me in the comments after watching my cam videos. So with that being said, if you're in search of true knowledge in multiple rare forms, this video will be well worth the watch, especially being as you're not paying for this information. And as I have said, everything I will be sharing today is empirically proven to work and will be backed by more dyno data than you will find anywhere, especially in one place. Now, I know that LSA is considered a result of valve event placement, and that would be somewhat correct, but only up to a certain degree. This is just the most common thing you will typically hear someone that may call themselves a professional say, or what you may hear someone regurgitate when they think they understand valve event timing, or are acting like they understand valve event timing, or even optimal valve event timing for that matter. But LSA being a result of valve event placement is just the most one-dimensional, or what could be considered closed-minded opinion or understanding of lobe separation angle that one could have. But from a cam grinding perspective, everything as far as valve event placement is determined by the degrees at which the intake and exhaust opening and closing points take place relative to the piston's position before, at, and after top and bottom dead center, along with the degrees of crankshaft rotation. So from a cam grinding perspective, LSA being a result is accurate. Now, I'm also going to add that yes, it is very important to have a thorough understanding of the effects of the placement of the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, the degrees of overlap, exhaust valve closed position, intake valve closed position, and the exhaust valve open position, along with when and why to adjust them accordingly to achieve a specific result depending on a multitude of influential factors. Now, I can assure you that I have a rather complete, and I mean complete, understanding of each individual valve event, their effects, and how to adjust them accordingly to achieve a specific result, along with when and why to do so depending on a multitude of influential factors. So I assure you that I'm well aware of how to select valve event timing for a given cubic inch engine combination for any given application and intended RPM range by many ways, including the most conventionally known way via the degrees that the intake valve opening position, exhaust valve closed position, intake valve closed position, and exhaust valve open position take place in relation to the piston's position in the cylinder before top dead center, after top dead center, before bottom dead center, and after bottom dead center, along with the degrees of crankshaft rotation. And of course, with this conventional one-dimensional understanding of valve events, the result from the placement of those valve events would then result in LSA, which is technically accurate but only to some extent. As I said, this is just the most common, one-dimensional, or what could even be considered closed-minded understanding of lobe separation angle. Now you have to understand that you can't expect 99% of the population to ever comprehend, let alone fully understand valve event timing, especially optimal valve event timing, let alone how to select a near optimal camshaft by the degrees at which the intake and exhaust valve opening and closing points take place in relation to the piston's position before top dead center, after top dead center, before bottom dead center, and after bottom dead center, along with the degrees of crankshaft rotation. More than 98% of the individuals that will say this is the correct way to choose valve events could not begin to select an optimal or near optimal camshaft that way if their life depended on it. Selecting valve events in that fashion, even for some of the top industry professionals, is still like playing educated roulette, or even some cases undereducated and overconfident roulette with valve events, in which case many people may as well be shooting in the dark trying to produce the most effective camshaft for a specific application and or get the most out of any given V8 engine application, while producing max potential volumetric efficiency across the entire RPM range. Now with all that being said, here are the answers to the things I had said to think about earlier. So as far as selecting optimal valve events go, lobe separation angle will not be a result of valve event placement. Lobe separation angle will be a starting point for optimal valve event timing. Optimal lobe separation angle sets the intake valve opening and closing points in the beginning of the optimal location. And as far as valve events go, lobe separation angle is what dictates the engine's ability to produce a given amount of torque and horsepower at any point in the RPM range, or what would be known as how fat the power curve is. It also has the potential to increase volumetric efficiency across the entire RPM range when optimal. Now with optimal LSA setting the intake valve opening and closing points in the beginning of the optimal location, it also places the beginning of overlap, aka the scavenging cycle, in the optimal location with the placement of the intake valve opening position. The intake valve opening position in combination with a given degrees of overlap will directly communicate with the exhaust valve close position during the scavenging cycle. Now overlap is what also dictates the general RPM at which peak torque will be produced, which is relative to the RPM at which peak horsepower will be produced. With an optimal LSA, the set overlap placement starting with the intake valve opening position in combination with a degrees of overlap will set the exhaust valve close position. Optimally placed overlap will provide the engine the ability to produce max potential volumetric efficiency. But when the forms of overlap utilized are inoptimally placed in the wrong location, it will hurt the characteristics of the overlap triangle and in turn negatively affects the efficiency of the scavenging cycle. Inoptimal timing or placement of overlap, aka the scavenging cycle, will hurt the engine's potential volumetric efficiency, along with the torque and horsepower production across the entire curve. So now this brings us to our first example of optimal valve events and overlap placement that are produced by optimal LSA. Before we fully dive into this, I'm going to mention that this dyno data came from Eric Weingartner's recent cam competition. Now I know he really wanted me to enter to prove myself, as he would like to say, but with me being disabled, the fact I take care of my grandmother who's in the very end stages of Alzheimer's, along with other problems I've been having, as much as I would have loved to enter a cam, there is no way in hell financially I could have made that happen. Hell, this is the first video I've made all year because of some of these issues I've been dealing with. Also, if you know anything about me, you would absolutely know that me not entering a cam in the competition is by no means due to a lack of testicular fortitude, aka balls on my part, as Eric keeps hilariously and indirectly implying. But I did manage to scrape up some money and donate to the Dyno Fund. This is how I got all the dyno data and the cam info for this comparison, so I really do appreciate Eric's dedication and the data he and Gary meticulously produced. There's no denying what he pulled off was impressive, and had I been in the position financially where I could have afforded to enter, I would have been one of the first to get in touch and send him $100 in a cam to enter. So shout out to Eric for what he did and for producing all the data I used to make this specific comparison, which just further displays the reality of valve event timing that I've been preaching in my videos. So check out Racing on YouTube for more information on this cam competition or the 408 LS test engine. Now note that the cam on the 108 LSA in this comparison I did based off the data from the cam testing was the all-out winner out of 23 different cams tested. This cam had won all 4 categories, just as I've been saying in my videos an optimal cam should do. Also take note, before we go over the data, I'm going to mention the LSAs of the top 3 cams out of 23 cams in the competition. First was obviously a 108, second was a 109, and third was a 108, which further just confirms what I've been saying. We'll go over the top 3 cams a little bit later in the video. And I will also show and explain why and how the 108 was calculated to be optimal a little later in the video. Now once again, as we dive into this data, I'm going to say that the torque and horsepower produced across the entire RPM range by the cam on the optimal 108 LSA is produced by the combination of valve events and overlap placement produced by optimal lobe separation angle. These effects are not known to exist by 99% of people, so this may boggle your mind. But if you have watched and paid attention to what I've said about the placement of valve events, overlap placement, optimal lobe separation angle, and the proper use of the exhaust valve opening position and exhaust duration in my last 2 videos, along with the data I provide, you would fully expect this to happen from a cam on an optimal 108 LSA, with the amount of overlap, the overlap triangle asymmetry with bias to the exhaust side, and the duration used. Now for those of you who don't know, this dyno data was produced by 11.5:1 compression 408 cubic inch LS engine with ported aftermarket 11 degree LS3 heads on it, so it has 2.165 intake valves, and the low lift flow discharge coefficient falls between the 0.76 and 0.78 range. This comparison is a prime and beautiful example of what I said in my last cam video about a cam on an optimal lobe separation angle with equal overlap and less duration, or in the case of this specific data, an optimal 108 LSA with less overlap, so less overall duration than the other camshafts on inoptimal wider lobe separation angles, with more overlap, so more duration than the cam on the optimal 108 LSA, which, if you look at the dark blue line, as you can clearly see, is making the most horsepower and torque across the entire RPM range, which is what I've been proving in my cam videos with dyno data for the last 2 years. Now here's the specs for the 5 cams in this specific comparison. The first one is of course a 108 LSA with 238 degrees intake duration, 259 exhaust at 50 thousandths, which equals 32.5 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths, and that's the blue line. Second one is a 109 LSA with 247 intake, 257 on the exhaust at 50 thousandths, and that equals 34 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths. The third one is a 110 lobe separation angle with 255 intake, 261 exhaust at 50 thousandths, which equals 38 degrees of overlap at 50 thousandths, and that's the green line. The fourth one is a 111 with 246 intake, 26x on the exhaust at 50 thousandths, which it equals a minimum of 31 degrees overlap and a maximum of 35.5 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths, and that's the light blue line. This cam on the light blue line with the 26x exhaust duration was obviously a Brian Tooley cam. And the last one, the 5th cam, is a 112 with 246 intake, 256 exhaust at 50 thousandths, and that one has 26 degrees of overlap, and that's the purple line. Now, if you were to look at just the cam specs, a vast majority of individuals would think all these cams would at least make more peak horsepower than the cam on the 108 lobe separation angle. But as I've been saying, that's a very common and very incorrect misconception or fallacy amongst a vast majority of the high-performance industry. Now, the 108 LSA 239 intake 259 exhaust cam, which is the dark blue line, made 670 horsepower at peak at 6,700 RPMs. And as you can clearly see, it made the most horsepower across the entire curve. The 109 LSA 247 257 cam, which is the orange line, made the second most mid-range power, but made the least peak horsepower with 653 horsepower at 6,700 RPMs. The 110 255 261 cam, which is the green line, made the third most mid-range power, but the second most peak horsepower was 665 horsepower at 6,700 RPMs. The 111 246 260X, which is the light blue line, made the least mid-range horsepower. the third most peak horsepower with 663 horsepower at 6,600 RPMs, and the last cam, the 112, 244, 256 cam, which is the purple line, made the third most mid-range horsepower and the third most horsepower with 665 horsepower, or 655 horsepower at 6,600 RPMs. Now to the torque data. The 108, 238, 259 cam, which once again is the dark blue line, made 565 pound-feet at 5,200 RPMs and clearly made the most torque across the entire RPM range. The 109, 247, 257 cam, which is the orange line, made 557 pound-feet at 5,100 RPMs. The 110, 255, 261 cam, which is the green line, made 550 pound-feet at 5,100 RPMs. The 110, 246, 26X cam, which is the light blue line, made 542 pound-feet at 5,400 RPMs. And the 112, 244, 256 cam, which is the purple line, made 552 pound-feet at 5,200 RPMs. Now notice within the torque curves that the only cam that made power consistently above all the others is the cam on the 108 LSA, meaning every other cam gave up either bottom end or top end horsepower or torque in exchange for the other. But with the optimal 108 LSA, you can have it all the way across the curve. This is just our first example of valve events produced by optimal LSA and was not a direct LSA only comparison like usual. But this data/video should hopefully shatter the common misconception where the cam on the optimal LSA, just because it may be considered tighter, has a major disadvantage. This video should shatter the belief that optimal LSA don't exist or that optimal LSA don't matter for those who live in reality and go by the data. So as far as valve event selection and power production go, optimal LSA and overlap placement have been quantified through thousands upon thousands upon thousands of specific and rigorous dyno tests. And as I have said and have proven time and time again, as far as valve events go, LSA will be the starting point in camshaft selection. And as far as valve events go, once again, LSA and overlap placement have the biggest effects on an engine's performance characteristics and output. So why start with optimal LSA and overlap placement, and what influences it? Well, optimal LSA and overlap placement have been empirically quantified, and it produces the starting point for the optimal placement of the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, exhaust valve closed position, and the intake valve closed position. The goal here is to start the very beginning of the induction cycle with the optimally timed intake valve opening position, to start the overlap placement at the ideal time and the most critical point at the very beginning of the induction cycle. If the intake valve is opened too late or too early and the overlap starts too late or too early without the pressure differential occurring at the correct time at the point when the intake valve and the exhaust valve are opening and closing, it will affect the ability of the scavenging cycle to aid in the potential of the induction cycle. If you do not begin to fill the cylinder at precisely the correct time, it will be physically impossible to make up for any percentage in lost trapped combustible intake charge mass in the cylinder, aka the loss in trapped volumetric efficiency from incorrect placement of intake valve opening position, overlap placement, exhaust valve closed position, and intake valve closed position. Any potential trapped volumetric efficiency that is lost at this very critical point in the beginning of the induction cycle from incorrect placement of these valve events will be physically impossible to gain back, even with optimally planned out induction system, cylinder heads, and exhaust with good velocity, high kinetic energy, and good pressure recovery dynamics of the convergent and divergent regions within the engine, all of which in combination, even without optimal valve events, may still bring about inertial column supercharging, adding positive pressure to the cylinder well after bottom dead center. But even so, as far as optimally timed valve events, as far as the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, exhaust valve closed position, intake valve closed position, and the exhaust valve opening position, you will not be able to achieve the highest level of potential trapped volumetric efficiency that the specific cubic inch engine combination was capable of achieving. On the other hand, with the optimally timed intake valve opening position presenting flow to the cylinder at the perfect time, in conjunction with help from the delta pressure wave brought about by cylinder evacuation at the exhaust valve opening position and exhaust valve closing position, the eduction pulse at the intake valve opening point in turn with a given degrees of overlap will directly communicate with the exhaust valve closing position in the overlap period, aka the scavenging cycle, to aid in the intake valve opening position at the beginning of the induction cycle, with the exhaust valve closing position being the end of the scavenging cycle. Both the intake valve opening position and exhaust valve closing position, in combination with matched ideal rocker ratios, rod ratios, discharge coefficients, intake valve diameters, compression ratios, expansion ratios, cubic inches, and desired RPM range, will in turn dictate the beginning for the optimal timing for the intake valve opening position to start the induction cycle to begin to more efficiently fill the cylinder, while at the same time in the overlap period. During the scavenging cycle takes place efficient evacuation of the cylinder during the exhaust valve closing position, with simultaneously in the process of expelling the remainder of exhaust gases out the headers, creates a pressure delta at the exhaust valve, which in turn creates a pressure drop in the cylinder. This pressure drop directly communicates with the intake tract and aids the optimally timed intake valve opening position during the induction process by creating more velocity and kinetic energy, which increases the dynamic inertia within the combustible intake charge in the induction system, which allows it to more efficiently fill the cylinder without over-scavenging intake charge from the cylinder and expelling it out the exhaust. Optimal cylinder filling without over-scavenging the cylinder is due to the optimally timed intake valve opening position, which produces optimal placement of overlap. All this in turn allows the optimally timed intake valve opening position, overlap placement, exhaust valve close position, in combination with matched ideal compression and expansion ratios, rocker ratios, rod ratios, intake valve diameter, and discharge coefficients, to more efficiently fill and evacuate the cylinder, which enables the optimally placed intake valve close position to take advantage of an optimally or near optimally filled cylinder, all of which increases volumetric efficiency and creates more torque and horsepower across the entire curve every time. Optimal LSA and overlap placement together will result in a rarely known, basically secret phenomenon that increases volumetric efficiency across the entire RPM range. It will produce the most pound-feet per cubic inch and horsepower per cubic inch across the entire RPM range that a given cubic inch engine combination was set up to produce. Depending on the cubic inches and general output of the engine, you will see gains of 20 to 80 pound-feet and 20 to 50 horsepower over an LSA that is just 2 to 6 degrees wider or even tighter. The empirical method of optimal LSA and overlap placement is backed by empirical evidence and also has empirical equations which are proven to work, or they wouldn't be empirical. So with it being empirically proven through the rigors of scientific method, it is always reproducible, which will be seen in the form of independent dyno data. Optimal LSA is backed by, and simply put has been quantified through empirical research and accurate data analysis of said empirical evidence, which was produced by thousands upon thousands of specific and rigorous dyno tests. In the research process for the empirical method for optimal lobe separation angle and overlap placement, it was found thousands and thousands of times over and over again that optimal LSA and overlap placement is creating max potential volumetric efficiency by producing ideal timing of the intake valve opening position, exhaust valve close position, intake valve close position, and the exhaust valve opening position in relation to taking positive and negative pressure measurements in the cylinder, the intake ports, and the exhaust ports, while measuring the ideal crankshaft angle and the piston's position in the cylinder before, at, and after top and bottom dead center, along with the piston speed, the piston dwell points, and the speed at which the piston accelerates from those dwell points. Then we take into account bore, stroke, rod length, compression expansion ratios, rocker ratio, and the rate at which low lift flow on the intake side is presented to the cylinder during the valve curtain area exposure. All of this will then be relative to a cylinder head's low lift flow region coefficient of discharge of a given intake valve diameter in relation to a given cubic inch displacement cylinder. Now usually the typical 2-valve conventional V8 cylinder head's low to mid lift flow discharge coefficient will vary from anywhere from about 0.70 up to as high as about 0.88 to 0.90, depending on the cylinder head's CFM flow numbers that have given lift. This is also affected by the valve job, the valve seat angle, the valve curtain area, and the overall flow of the cylinder head's intake port, so discharge coefficients will vary. This is all going to be in relation to a cubic inch displacement of a given cylinder, which will then be relative to the given intake valve diameter, which which once again, along with the numerical constant, will be partially representative of the coefficient of discharge of a given cylinder head. So what exactly is the coefficient of discharge? The coefficient of discharge represents the overall efficiency of flow within a given cylinder head's intake port or exhaust port and how efficiently the flow is discharged by a given intake valve diameter's curtain area throughout any given point in the lift range. Simply put, the coefficient of discharge is a measurement of the efficiency of effective flow area versus ideal flow area. The explanation of the coefficient of discharge also makes for a little proof for those few people that think that cylinder heads aren't taken into account in the empirical process of optimal lobe separation angle selection and optimal overlap placement. The coefficient of discharge of a given cylinder head's intake valve is a more thorough measurement of efficiency than just flow numbers, cross-sectional area, port volume, velocity, or swirl characteristics alone. Also note, the higher the coefficient of discharge of a given cylinder head has, the less overlap and duration the engine needs for a given cubic inches to achieve a specific RPM range. Now, what I'm about to explain next would make for a calculation that would require you to know the flow numbers of your cylinder head to calculate the discharge coefficient. This is just a slightly more involved calculation compared to using the standard empirical equation, which is accurate and applicable at least 99% of the time. So here is how the coefficient of discharge affects the 128 constant and the other numerical constant for other V8 engines that can be used in place of the 128 in the empirical equation. Now here is a very short and simple example of the variance in coefficients of discharge and how to adjust the constants accordingly. The increasing numerical change to the constants according to the coefficient of discharge in this next example applies to the constants applicable to all the engines, all of which will be increased by the same numerical value in relation to the increase to a higher discharge coefficient. Now the low lift flow coefficient of discharge of most 2-valve conventional V8 cylinder heads, as I said, will vary from about 0.70 to 0.88, 0.90. And for the selection of optimal lobe separation angle, we want to focus specifically on the intake side low lift flow discharge coefficient. A cylinder head with a 0.70 to 0.78 coefficient of discharge on the intake side at low lift will use the standard 128 constant and use the other standard constant for different engines in the empirical equation. Believe it or not, even with the big difference in cylinder heads from valve angle, port dimensions, flow numbers, etc. between 23-degree small block Chevys and even 18-degree small block Chevys versus 15-degree LS engines. Even with the relative big difference between them, they all three share that 128 constant. You will see dyno proof of small block Chevys and LS3s sharing the 128 constant a little bit later in the video. Now for you LS guys that think LS engines like wide lobe separation angles, you will see in this video with dyno proof that they don't. Also, here, just for a little example, is an LS3 cylinder head's coefficient of discharge to put this into perspective. A stock LS3 head with a 2.165 valve has a 0.76 to 0.78 low lift discharge coefficient. The LS3 head drops to about 0.56 at around 500 lift and peaks back to about 0.58 at 700 lift. The stock LS3 head and even some ported stock LS3 heads fall within the 0.70 to 0.78 coefficient of discharge range, which, just like the small block Chevy, uses the 128 constant in the equation. Now, if you want to be more precise in your valve event calculation, technically anything over a 0.75 discharge coefficient can go up in constant, as we've seen with the results produced by the cam test that Eric Weingartner recently did. With the 11.5 to 1 compression 408 cubic inch LS3 engine, with ported aftermarket 11-degree LS3 heads and a low lift coefficient of discharge that falls in between the 0.76 and 0.78 range. On the other hand, here's an example of a DV ported AFR 235 LS3 cylinder head with a 2.08 valve, not a 2.165 valve. If this head had a 2.165 valve, the coefficient of discharge would have been lower. This AFR 235 LS3 head that DV gave love to has a coefficient of discharge of 0.87 with increased efficiency across the entire lift range compared to the as-cast AFR head. Now, to show an example that it isn't just about the coefficient of discharge number of a cylinder head, but it's the coefficient of a discharge of a given cylinder head's intake valve diameter, because the intake valve is the restriction, so the specific diameter is an influential factor. If this AFR 235 head had the same 0.87 coefficient of discharge, but instead of having a 2.08 intake valve, It had the standard LS3 2.165 intake valve. Depending on the cubic inches that it would be put on top of, it would require a lobe separation angle 0.5 to 0.75 degrees wider with the 2.165 valve and a 0.87 coefficient of discharge. Now moving on, here are the adjustments that need to be made to the constants in the empirical equation according to a higher discharge coefficient. These numerical adjustments to the constants will easily get you within a tolerance of plus or minus 1 degree from the optimal lobe separation angle. A low lift flow discharge coefficient of 0.78 to 0.83 will use a 128, 128.5 to 129 as the constant in place of the 128. If it's a really good to exceptional 2-valve V8 cylinder head with a 0.83 to 0.90 coefficient of discharge, it will call for somewhere in between 129, 129.5, 130, 130.5 to 131 to be the constant. A 0.90 coefficient of discharge is getting into the 4-valve per cylinder head coefficient of discharge regions, which is pretty damn good for a 2-valve conventional cylinder head to get that high. It's safe to say that damn near all 2-valve V8 cylinder heads you will typically get a hold of, including, for example, good aftermarket and even ported LS cylinder heads, will typically have a low lift flow discharge coefficient that falls somewhere between 0.70 and 0.90. The equation to figure out the discharge coefficient of your given cylinder head is window area equals valve diameter times pi times lift, and then you take your window area and multiply that by 146 CFM per square inch, and that'll give you your theoretical maximum flow area. Then you take a flow at a given lift and divide it by your theoretical maximum, and this is the ratio of effective flow to actual flow, or what is known as your discharge coefficient. Now with this information set in place, I'm going to show the connection between valve events and the cubic inch per inch of intake valve diameter and its relationship to the coefficient of discharge. Now keep in mind in this next example that this 202 intake valve diameter is going to be partially representative of, say, a coefficient of discharge of 0.741, which will be representative of the low lift flow efficiency of this cylinder head. Now here's a very simple example in the case of a 10-to-1 355 with a 202 intake valve, which is 21.96 cubic inches per inch of intake valve diameter, versus say a 10-to-1 383, which is 23.7 cubic inches per inch of intake valve diameter. Also, just to note, the 202 intake valve diameter is also 50% of the 4.030 bore diameter. Now, if you were to use that same cylinder head from the 355 on a 383, that same 0.741 discharge coefficient of that 202 intake valve now has to begin to feed a larger cylinder of 47 cubic inches in the 383 versus 44.375 in the 355. With that being said, the 10-to-1 383 will require a 106 lobe separation angle to place the intake valve opening position, intake valve close position, and overlap placement in the beginning of the optimal location to allow the cylinder head to fill the larger cylinder most effectively without over-scavenging the cylinder. While in the case of the 10-to-1 355 on the other hand, will optimally require a 108 to do the same. Now with that said, keep in mind between the 108 LSA and the 106 LSA there's of course 2 degree change in lobe separation angle. That 2 degree change in lobe separation angle will equate to 4 degrees more overlap. Now with that same cylinder head with the 202 intake valve and the 0.741 coefficient of discharge from the 355 installed on the 383, although the 106 lobe separation angle that is optimal for the 383 provides 4 degrees more overlap over the 108 LSA that's optimal for the 355, in order for the 383 to achieve the same RPM range as the 355 with that same cylinder head, the 383 will require an additional 1 degree of overlap increase per every 5 to 8 cubic inches increase in overall displacement to achieve about the same RPM range for peak torque and horsepower as the 355. So for the 383, add 4 to 6 degrees more overlap in the form of duration on top of the 4 degrees overlap brought about by the 2 degree change in the lobe separation angle to maintain the optimal 106 LSA for the optimal placement of the intake valve opening position, intake valve close position, and the overlap placement for the 383. The 383 will of course make more torque and horsepower, and it will be at relatively the same RPM range as the 355. Now here's a little example of what to do with the overlap. That 4 to 6 degrees of overlap added to the 383 will be in the form of duration. It will increase the overlap by widening the base of the overlap triangle, and it will add a little more area to the overlap triangle. You can either keep the overlap triangle symmetrical in shape, or change the shape of the overlap triangle to an asymmetrical overlap triangle with bias towards either the intake side or the exhaust side by adding either more intake duration or more exhaust duration. Now keep in mind that a 1 degree change in intake or exhaust duration equals 0.5 degrees overlap, and a 1 degree change in lobe separation angle equals a 2 degree change in overlap. Now if you have a better understanding, you could look at exhaust duration according to when you want cylinder blowdown to occur, your target potential pumping losses, or whether you want a symmetrical overlap triangle or an asymmetrical overlap triangle with bias towards either the intake or exhaust, which would be achieved by either more or less intake duration or exhaust duration, or equal intake and exhaust duration. Another way to look at this, though not the best way to build power, more exhaust duration will increase power production above 3,500 RPMs or above peak torque, and will typically allow the engine to carry power longer past peak. But depending on how much exhaust duration over the intake duration, there comes a point when exhaust duration will negatively affect torque production and decrease power below 3,500 RPMs. Also, in an inoptimal situation, it may also be necessary to increase exhaust duration to aid cylinder evacuation with low-flowing exhaust ports or restrictive exhaust systems. But this is just a band-aid for the root issue and will never be optimal. So now this brings us to our next dyno data point about the use of optimal LSA and exhaust duration, which means optimal timing of the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, intake valve close position, and the proper use of exhaust duration or earlier exhaust valve opening and later exhaust valve closing, which, as I previously stated and displayed in my first cam video, exhaust duration will increase torque and horsepower above 3,500 RPMs or above peak torque, and make more torque and horsepower while typically allowing the engine to carry RPM longer past peak torque and horsepower. The only downside to this is there is a point where it will decrease torque and horsepower below peak torque, and this is exactly what separated the first and third place cams in the 23 cam competition. The first place cam, which was the orange line, was the 108 LSA with 238 intake, 259 exhaust, and the third place cam, which is the blue line, was a 108 LSA with 235 intake, 247 exhaust. Both first and third place cams had very near the same intake valve opening position within 1 degree, and the intake valve closing events were within 2 degrees, but the exhaust valve opening and closing events were a lot earlier and later, both exhaust events being about 6 and 7 degrees difference on the 238 259 cam versus the 235 247 cam. Therefore, the 238 259 cam, with its 6 degrees earlier exhaust valve opening position and its 6 degrees later exhaust valve closing position, it started to expel exhaust gases from the cylinder earlier, emptying the cylinder more completely, which led to more efficient evacuation of the cylinder above 4,700 RPMs. This is due to the pressure differential occurring at the correct time, along with there being more of a pressure differential when the intake valve is opening, which simply means that the exhaust valve opening position and exhaust valve close position evacuated the cylinder more completely, which created more of a pressure drop in the cylinder. This then allowed the optimally placed intake valve opening position and overlap placement to take better advantage of the cylinder head and more efficiently fill the cylinder, which in turn allows the intake valve closing position to take advantage of an optimally filled cylinder. Now, as you can see, the 235 247 cam obviously made more torque and horsepower below peak torque and made a little less peak torque and horsepower, just as one would expect. The 238 259 cam, which once again is the orange line, made less torque and horsepower below peak, but the early opening and late closing exhaust valve event helped make more peak torque, more peak horsepower, and more torque and horsepower past peak, just as expected. Now, if the 235 247 cam had 10 to 13 degrees more exhaust duration, there would have been 2 cams that made more power across the entire RPM range than all the other cams with almost identical power curves. Now, I'm going to be 100% honest. The cam I had calculated and came up with turned out to be a 236 261 on a 108 with a 104 degree intake centerline. So I would end up in either a very close second or first place, but I believe a 236, 261 may still make more torque and horsepower across the curve. I knew to keep it between 235 to 240 degrees on the intake and 257 to 263 on the exhaust on a 108 LSA, but after seeing the data, I could do better. Anyway, now let's bring in the 109 LSA 247 263 cam that got third place, which is going to be the green line. Now this is once again just another beautiful display of what I've been saying in this video, in my last two videos, about optimal valve event timing starting with optimal LSA. Now there are obviously other ways of coming to this conclusion for valve events, but if your intake valve opening position, overlap placement, and intake valve close position are not in the correct location, no amount of overlap, duration, lift, advance, or fancy lobe profiles will help you recover the loss in trap volumetric efficiency or torque and horsepower production across the entire RPM range, period, which is a rarely known but proven fact I've known about for over 25 years, and now I'm trying to share this knowledge with you in these videos. Without an optimal lobe separation angle, you will not make the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range, period. Now notice that both cams on 108 LSAs made more torque and horsepower everywhere, up until 6100 RPMs, where the 109 247 263 cam, with 37 degrees of overlap at 50 thousandths, finally gained more power than the 108 235 247 cam, but only due to the bias of the overlap triangle and the placement of the exhaust valve opening and closing position. As you can see with your own eyes, without optimal placement of the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, and intake valve close position, the 109 LSA 247 263 cam didn't even make more peak torque than the 235 247 cam on an optimal 108 LSA. Now also, as you can see, the 235 247 cam on the optimal 108 LSA even carried peak torque longer than the 109 247 263 cam, and the 235 247 cam on a 108 LSA only has 25 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths, while the 109 247 263 cam has 37 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths. The data in this video just destroyed the common held belief amongst the vast majority of people and many professionals that the tighter LSA, even with equal overlap or more overlap, will make more peak torque, make more torque and horsepower below peak, but will make less peak horsepower and always fall off first after peak before the wider LSA, which is clearly not the case, as you can see here and as I showed earlier. Hell, the 108 238 259 cam only has 32.5 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths, and the 109 247 263 cam has 37 degrees overlap. But the 108 238 259 cam still made more torque and horsepower everywhere across the entire curve. So for those of you that keep saying the 108 238 259 cam got first place because of the overlap, or that so-and-so didn't do good in the competition because they didn't have enough overlap, or that the degrees of overlap is more important than lobe separation angle, intake valve opening position, overlap placement, and intake valve close position, it's been proven on the dyno that 1 degree of lobe separation angle has a 500% larger effect on torque and horsepower production than a 1 degree change in intake valve close position or a 2 degree change in duration. So if you're hung up on overlap solely, and that is your thought process, I would really start to question my cognitively biased afflictions and what I think I know, because this is once again unbiased data that just proves otherwise. And for those of us who live in reality, accurate data don't lie. So with that said, you're poorly mistaken with your incorrect or incomplete information you perceive to be true and complete knowledge. Yes, overlap is extremely important, but you can only use so much overlap for a given task, and overlap means absolutely nothing when it's not placed in the optimal location, in combination with optimally timed valve events and area within the overlap triangle, as you can clearly see here in this data. Now, if the third place 108 LSA 239 intake duration cam had a 257 exhaust duration instead of a 247, we would be seeing two cams making the most power across the entire curve, and the second place cam, which was the 109, 247, 263, would have been third place because, as you can see, the 109, 247, 263 only got second place due to it using 263 degrees of exhaust duration. Second place only beat third place, the 108, 235, 247 cam, above 6,100 RPMs due to the effects of exhaust valve events. Now also notice the display of the intake side being able to effectively utilize power increases from the exhaust valve events on the 238, 259 cam, with the 108 LSA being as it has the advantage of optimally timed intake valve opening position, overlap placement, and intake valve closing position. This is displayed in the power curves produced by the 238, 259 cam on a 108 LSA versus the 109, 247, 263 cam. The effects from the exhaust valve events come into effect much sooner at 4,900 RPMs with the 108, 238, 259 cam compared to 6,100 RPMs for the 109, 247, 263 cam. Now as we continue on, I'm going to mention that being as lift is one of the two most understood specs. We won't be talking about lift today, except I will mention the fact that when it comes to lift, use as much lift as you're comfortable with for your specific application, but be real with yourself about your intended use and the expectations of what you really want. Also, yes, you can lift the valve beyond max flow, but only to a certain point. I built many engines like this with great success. So for example, say your head has a peak flow of 300 CFM at 600 lift, but falls off after 600, and by 650 it's at 290 CFM. So for example, if you were trying to get the most out of a given combination, in this scenario, you could lift the valve to say 620 to 650, because it's only going to be at past max flow for a very, very small fraction of a second once per cycle. But with the valve being lifted to 620 or 650, the valve will be at peak flow 2 times per cycle, providing more time at peak flow, which presents more flow to the cylinder and also allows for the utilization of higher port velocity from being at a higher lift, which creates and allows more dynamic inertial energy to build up in the intake track due to the increase in kinetic energy and velocity of combustible intake charge brought about by the increase in overall peak flow to the cylinder. Using this method, your intake valve is at peak flow longer, and once again you will see peak flow once on the opening ramp of the intake lobe, then be past peak flow for a very small fraction of a second, then see peak flow again on the closing side of the intake lobe. I will also add that lift also has an effect on the area within the overlap triangle. It does not affect the degrees of overlap, just the area within the triangle itself. And just like lobe separation angle, lift will of course affect piston to valve clearance. So because lift is the most well understood spec amongst most people, we will instead continue to focus on the least understood and most influential aspects. Now, contrary to the very popular mainstream misconception that has been fed to the public for decades, it isn't just duration or lift that ultimately dictates an engine's RPM operating range, and it definitely don't dictate an engine's torque and horsepower potential across the entire curve. Though duration is a factor, as I have shown, it is just a very small part of the equation, and duration alone will not increase volumetric efficiency across the entire curve, unless you have a 4-pattern camshaft with opening and closing points tuned for specific intake manifold runner lengths. The longer intake runner favors low to mid-range torque and horsepower, so it requires more overlap and duration than a shorter intake runner to achieve the same RPM range. But unlike long runners, which favor low to mid-range torque and horsepower but will limit high RPM torque and horsepower, short runners, on the other hand, will reduce low to mid-range torque and horsepower in favor for high RPM horsepower and torque, but will require less overlap and duration to achieve the same RPM range. I may touch on 4-pattern camshafts a little later, but most likely I will make a video about it and fully address that subject by itself. So stick around through this entire video and you will get a lot more rare information you will not find anywhere else on the internet, because it just don't exist, especially all in one place, at least up until now. Now, to help simplify some of the science and dynamic complexities surrounding the subject and the variables of selecting an optimal lobe separation angle, I will be showing an empirical equation created by the man himself, Mr. David Vizard. The reason I advocate for DV's empirical process and his empirical LSA equation is because the results produced by DV's equation line up with a few of my equations, and just so happened to produce the same results as the complex and empirical methods I learned growing up. With that being the case, I just so happen to be one of the rare individuals that intuitively fully comprehends DB's methods and can personally prove these methods simply from my own previous experience, along with the empirical evidence I had been exposed to growing up and have personally acquired throughout my entire life. I had first came across DB's equation shortly after he had given me a compliment on the 383 out of my mud racing truck. More specifically, he complimented me on the valve events I had chosen for that specific engine and its output. At the time, I knew who DB was. I had read a few of his books a long time ago, but I didn't know his empirical valve event selection method at the time. A few days later, I was scrolling through DB's old YouTube channel, and I came across his LSA equation, and the first few numbers I had ran with DB's equation, I damn near instantly understood DB's concept without previously ever seeing his equation, let alone studying his method. After running just a few more numbers with his equation, I could easily visualize in my mind the potential results from my past experience and the dyno data produced by my past experiences. I could see the potential outcomes produced by the LSA's DB's equation would produce for a given cubic inch engine within a given set of parameters. So it was at that point about a year and a half ago, I had come to the indefinite conclusion that both DB's and my methods results were practically identical for optimal LSA and the quantification of valve events, so to say. I believe both methods have been influenced by the same parameters, coefficients, variables, functions, predictors, etc. I believe both methods have gone through the process known as a polynomial regression, and both methods' results have also concluded in similar empirical evidence produced by Dyno Data, brought about through decades of specific research in the form of tens of thousands of rigorous and specific dyno tests, along with accurate data acquisition and analysis, which was conceptually proven, then put into action and justified by a lot of against the odds, consistent back-to-back championship wins, and decades of race-winning success. The results produced by the complex ways I learned and DB's methods are both proven to work. This is why I advocate for DB's empirical equation for lobe separation angle and the way he calculates duration. Both DB's and my calculations say that lobe separation angle and overlap will produce duration. Both equations are different, but they both produce the same exact results, and that's not a coincidence. Now I already know for a fact, and as you will see with unbiased independent dyno data, that DB's lobe separation angle equation is proven to select the optimal lobe separation angle for max potential pound-feet per cubic inch and horsepower per cubic inch across the entire RPM range in damn near any given naturally aspirated, conventional headed 2-valve V8 engine combination without variable valve timing. The knowledge in this video will either produce near max potential trapped volumetric efficiency for within a given cubic inch engine combination for a given application in RPM range, or will provide the ability to produce max trapped volumetric efficiency well beyond 100% when matched with the ideally tuned induction system as far as carb size, spacer configuration, intake manifold type, runner size, runner length, runner taper, plenum volume, runner to plenum configuration, etc., in conjunction with the appropriately selected and modified cylinder heads with sufficient flow, ideal cross-sectional area, good port velocity, ideally calculated and modified intake to exhaust flow and throat percentages, optimally calculated and modified convergent and divergent regions for good pressure recovery dynamics, and efficient combustion chamber characteristics accompanied by optimally tuned exhaust system as far as combustion chamber configuration and characteristics, exhaust valve job, exhaust port throat percentage, exhaust port shape, exhaust port divergent expansion angles, and exhaust port volume, all of which will be accented by proper header primary design, primary diameters, primary lengths, along with the collector design, collector shape, collector diameter, collector length, collector extensions, or exhaust. When all these potential variables are optimal or near optimally calculated and modified, then optimal LSA and overlap placement in combination with a given degrees of overlap and a given degrees of duration will produce the optimal placement for the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, exhaust valve closed position, intake valve closed position, and the exhaust valve open position. These optimally timed valve events will provide the ability for a well-tuned naturally aspirated race engine to achieve max potential volumetric efficiency up to around 150% or thereabout. Achieving a trapped volumetric efficiency this high comes down to utilizing things like delta pressure wave tuning or pressure differential tuning, Helmholtz resonance, and refractive pulse waveform tuning on the intake and exhaust. When properly tuned, these factors will produce a phenomenon known as inertial column supercharging via the dynamic inertial capacity of the kinetic energy brought about by high velocity combustible intake charge mass being rammed at the back of the intake valve. When the intake valve opens at the ideal time, upon the positive pressure from the refractive pulse waveform in the intake port ramming the back of the intake valve, this pressurized combustible intake charge mass is then pulsed into the cylinder at higher than atmospheric pressure upon intake valve opening. As the pressure drop in the cylinder occurs from the intake valve opening position and the exhaust valve closed position being open at the same time, during the overlap period, aka the scavenge cycle, this increases the dynamic inertia via increasing the velocity and kinetic energy of the combustible intake charge mass being pulsed into the cylinder at a positive pressure, which will continue to forcibly fill the cylinder after bottom dead center, resulting in a trapped volumetric efficiency up around 150% or thereabout. It's not uncommon to see naturally aspirated V8 race engines with 8 to 15 psi G above absolute atmospheric pressure trapped in the cylinder upon intake valve close position, essentially turning a naturally aspirated V8 engine into a finely tuned, naturally aspirated dynamic inertially forced induction engine. Now this here is a really cool graph showing the results of what I just described. This is what is going on in a naturally aspirated V8 racing engine that is producing well over 100% volumetric efficiency, with near optimal valve event timing and a well-spec'd and tuned intake and exhaust. This graph and knowledge is also something you will absolutely not see in any other camshaft or engine performance videos online. You won't get this specific information anywhere else online for that matter. This chart and conglomeration of knowledge being exposed to the internet in this video is exclusive to CattleDogGarage&Racing. Now I highly recommend you listen to what I'm about to say and study this chart. If you have any questions about this chart at all, just ask and I will answer. This chart gives a good visual representation and represents the pressure events, pressure differentials, and refractive pulse waveforms within a well-spec'd and tuned race engine relative to optimal valve event timing. It shows the refractive pulse waveforms going back and forth in the intake and exhaust at positive and negative pressures while hitting the backside of the intake and exhaust valve. And it also displays the pressure differentials and shows that when optimally timed, these refractive pulse waveforms contribute to what is known as inertial ramming effect, and also contributes to inertial column supercharging, which produces higher than atmospheric pressure in the cylinder upon intake valve close position. These pressure pulses are displayed in relation to the timing of the intake valve opening position, overlap, exhaust valve close position, intake valve close position, and the exhaust valve opening position. At the top of the chart, you will notice it lists the valve events from left to right as IC for intake close, EO for exhaust open, IO for intake open, overlap, and EC for exhaust close. It also shows the point of ignition in top dead center. Now look to the far left side of the chart going vertical. It gives a pressure scale in bars of pressure or atmospheres, with 1 being absolute pressure with a value of 14.7 psia. So anything over 1, or the 14.7 psia mark, is positive pressure or psig, and anything below 1 is obviously negative pressure, or what is known as psiv, which can be converted to inches of water to better put the pressure drop into better perspective. Now at the bottom of the graph horizontally, it also displays the degrees of crankshaft rotation, and also notice on the graph that the intake track's refractive pulse waveform pressure going back and forth from the plenum to the intake valve is the red sine wave looking line. The exhaust refractive waveform pulse at the exhaust valve to the header is the green line, and the black line is in cylinder pressure. Now let's paint a little picture here. Imagine the crankshaft on this engine is spinning 9,000 RPMs. The pistons are moving up and down in the cylinder at a high rate of speed. Intake and exhaust valves are rapidly opening and closing, and there are pulses of combustible intake charge gases and combusted exhaust gases going back and forth in the intake track and exhaust system. Now look at the intake valve opening position on the chart and follow its vertical red line down, and notice as the intake valve opening position takes place that the red line that looks like a sine wave, which represents the intake's refractive pulse waveform pressure at the intake valve, Notice that the waveform pulse of combustible intake charge is about 0.3 times higher than atmospheric pressure, or about 4.41 psig at the back of the intake valve, right before and at the time the intake valve opens. As the intake valve opens, this positive pressure pulse instantly begins to forcibly fill the cylinder as the scavenging cycle also begins due to the start of the overlap period at the intake valve opening position. As this happens, a pressure delta takes place out the exhaust, and a pressure drop in the cylinder occurs of negative 0.5 atmospheres, or about negative 7.35 psiv, which is equal to a pressure drop of 203.65 inches of water. This massive pressure drop takes place inside the cylinder as exhaust gases are rapidly expelled or literally sucked out of the cylinder past the exhaust valve, through the exhaust port and out the header. Because as the exhaust valve is closing, it's creating an extremely high velocity vacuum in the cylinder, in turn removing all exhaust gases from the cylinder, and at the same time creating this 7.35 psiv, or 203.65 inches of water pressure drop in the cylinder, which at the same time sucks in the already positive 4.41 psig pressurized wave pulse of combustible intake charge that's being forcibly rammed at the cylinder upon intake valve opening position. The pressure differential seen between the sucking force of 7.35 psiv, or 203.65 inches of water in the cylinder, and the pressure force of 4.41 psig in the port at intake valve opening is equal to a pressure differential of 11.76 psiv or equal to a pressure drop of 325.84 inches of water in the cylinder. Each subsequent increase in pressure differential is equal to an increase in psiv seen in the cylinder when you add the psig in the intake port at intake valve opening position. As this pressure differential increases, it in turn also is increasing the intake charge velocity and kinetic energy, which also increases the dynamic inertial force of combustible intake charge. This in turn is increasing the cylinder compressing potential by creating what's known in fluid dynamics as compressible flow, which is flow that is increased density due to being at a high velocity during inertial column supercharging, which will turn that 11.76 psiv in the cylinder to a positive 14 plus psig at intake valve close position. Now notice on the chart, as the exhaust valve is closed, that it's at the lowest point of pressure drop in the cylinder. This is the point when the exhaust is no longer sucking on the cylinder and creating that pressure drop, aiding in the potential of the induction cycle. So from this point on, after the exhaust valve closes, notice that the cylinder pressure along with the intake pressure pulses begin to rise as the cylinder continues to be forcibly filled and the piston comes up after bottom dead center. Also notice the exhaust refractive pulse waveform pressure is rising to a peak because it just refracted off the closed exhaust valve just to be sent out the exhaust port, down the header primary to the collector to be refracted back to the exhaust valve again. Now pay attention in a second as we make our way from the far right side of the chart and continue to the far left side as we get past bottom dead center and we get closer to the intake valve close position. Now notice on the right hand side after the lowest part of the pressure drop in the cylinder, and pay attention how the intake pulse, aka the red line, and cylinder pressure, the black line, rise together as inertial column supercharging takes place, forcibly filling the cylinder well after bottom dead center. Now look to the left side of the chart and you will see that the cylinder pressure, which is the black line, and intake dynamic inertia from the intake pressure pulse, which is the red line, increases to as high as 1.6 atmospheres or 8.80 psig as dynamic inertia from the kinetic energy of high velocity column of combustible intake charge mass continues to ram the back of the intake valve while forcibly filling the cylinder as the piston continues to come up and the intake valve continues to close. At the point the intake valve is closed, there is around 2 atmospheres or 14.7 to 15 psig trapped in the cylinder. By the time the intake valve is closed, the kinetic energy and dynamic inertia of combustible intake charge at the back of the intake valve has now been reduced from 1.6 atmospheres or 8.80 psig to 1.5 atmospheres or 7.35 psig. This built up dynamic inertial energy in the waveform pulse at the back of the intake valve and in the intake tract was initially brought about by the kinetic energy of high velocity, high temp, expanding exhaust gases evacuating the cylinder, creating the pressure delta, aka pressure drop in the cylinder. which in turn aided the potential of the combustible intake charge by rapidly increasing its velocity and kinetic energy up instantly upon intake valve opening, creating the compressible flow and forcibly filling the cylinder as the exhaust was literally sucked out and efficiently evacuated from the cylinder, which aided in the total potential of the induction process to be able to create that 8.80 psig peak in the intake tract while compressing the charge in the cylinder before the intake valve closed. The energy in this waveform pulse at the back of the intake valve will be conserved and refracted back and forth at a specific resonance as positive and negative pressure waves or pulses from the back of the valve to the intake port to the plenum, just to refract back down the port to the back side of the intake valve as positive and negative pressure. This refractive waveform pulse energy in the intake tract will be used as the primary ramming force to forcibly fill the cylinder when the intake valve is opened again, but only if the intake refractive pulse pressure wave is ideally timed to be at a positive pressure pulse at the back of the intake valve when the intake valve opens and overlap takes place, as seen in the case with the waveform pulse and the ideal timing of the peak waveform pulse pressure of 4.41 psig at the intake valve when it opens. You do not want to have that waveform pulse at a negative pressure pulse when the intake valve opens. If that happens, you will end up with high RPM reversion, the engine will have port recovery issues, it will massively decrease the volumetric efficiency of the engine, it will destroy torque and horsepower production within the target RPM operating range of maximum power production, the engine won't rev fast, the engine's ability to recover RPMs upon shift will suffer. Basically, if the waveform pulses aren't tuned just right, the engine will simply be a lazy turd under load and acceleration and will not win races. Now notice on the chart, after the primary inertial ram at intake valve close where it says primary ramming, after the pressure peak of 7.35 psig upon intake close, the waveform pulse has refracted away and goes to a negative pressure of 5.88 psiv, or 162.92 inches of water sucking at the back of the intake valve, because after the intake valve closes, the dynamic inertia from the kinetic energy in the intake waveform pulse refracts back off the closed intake valve and goes back up the port into the plenum just to be refracted and pulsed right back down the port to the intake valve at a positive pressure. This waveform pulse goes back and forth until the intake valve opens again. Notice I said the pressure drop at the back of the intake valve when the waveform pulse refracted went from a positive pressure of 7.35 psig at the intake valve closing point, but when it pulsed backwards and went to the plenum, the pressure at the intake valve dropped to 5.88 psiv, or 162.92 inches of water sucking at the back of the intake valve. Instead of being at a positive pressure, you absolutely do not want to open the intake valve at a low point in the waveform pulse like this, because it will cause problems like I had just said and creates the situation where the engine's an underperforming, slow revving turd. Now the next thing to happen on the chart is ignition takes place about 28 to 30 degrees before the piston is at top dead center. Then in the power stroke, isentropic expansion takes place, cylinder pressure rises dramatically and the piston is rapidly forced down the bore. As the piston makes its way down the bore, before it gets to bottom dead center, the exhaust valve opens. Now notice when the exhaust valve opens that the waveform pulse at the back of the exhaust valve is at a low point, which is ideal because you don't want a positive pressure pulse at the back of the exhaust valve when it opens. That will hurt volumetric efficiency and power production. In this case, the exhaust valve opens when the waveform pulse is a hair just below atmospheric pressure. This would have been better if the waveform pulse at the back of the exhaust valve was at a lower pressure, but it's still good because this aids in cylinder evacuation during the exhaust blowdown process at the exhaust valve opening position and helps reduce pumping losses. Now notice after the exhaust valve opens that the pressure wave at the valve spikes up past 2 atmospheres. This is because the rapidly expanding high pressure combusted exhaust gases in the cylinder are being forced out of the exhaust past the exhaust valve and out the header. At the exhaust valve opening position, the cylinder begins to rapidly expand high pressure, high temperature exhaust gases, so to maintain a header pressure of anything less than 30 psi during the cylinder blowdown period is considered acceptable, and in the case of this engine there was only a peak of about 18 psi in the header during cylinder blowdown. Believe it or not, this is still creating a low pressure area for the high velocity, high pressure, high temperature exhaust gases to rapidly expand and evacuate the cylinder, which is represented by the black line, aka cylinder pressure, rapidly dropping in correlation with the green line, which is the exhaust pressure. And with that, you will see that the cycle starts all over again with the intake valve opening position, with positive pressure at the back of the intake valve from the conserved dynamic inertial energy in the waveform pulse of combustible intake charge. This energy was conserved from the high-velocity combustible gases forcibly filling the cylinder right up until the intake valve close point, then refracted back and forth in the intake tract until the intake valve opened again. Now, before we finish this chart up, I'm going to talk about a phenomenon that some have proposed may take place under the right conditions during the exhaust valve opening position and the exhaust valve close position. On the other hand, many top professionals and some physicists say it's more than likely impossible. Even some of the very top professionals like Darren Morgan, I believe, are still unsure of the empirical existence of the specific phenomenon I'm about to speak of. Now, I'm not taking anything away from Darren because he's top-notch. I just used him to display how rare this specific phenomenon is. I've also not had the chance to personally ask DV his stance on the existence of this phenomenon. Any rate, what I'm speaking of is supersonic flow. There is currently no known record or visual proof that supersonic flow exists or can form within the convergent and divergent regions in an internal combustion engine, let alone shoot a shockwave out the exhaust. Supersonic flow in the convergent and divergent regions in the exhaust may potentially occur immediately upon exhaust valve opening and may even continue to occur during the scavenging process as the exhaust valve closes and the intake valve begins to open near top dead center. This supersonic flow phenomenon would be aided with a tight quench at top dead center. Now, what I'm about to say may shock you, but as I said in the beginning of the video, I'm going to be showing proof that a specific phenomenon actually does exist, and that specific phenomenon is going to be supersonic flow. I'm going to be showing what supersonic flow looks like because I actually do have my own personal video proof that supersonic flow absolutely does exist, but it can only occur if the convergent and divergent regions within the engine are optimally calculated and correctly modified to be able to be influenced to do so in relation to a multitude of critical influential factors. Just a few of the factors focused on are optimally calculated and modified pressure recovery dynamics of the convergent and divergent regions within the cylinder head, intake tract, and exhaust. The whole exhaust system must be correctly designed from the combustion chamber to the exit tip of the exhaust pipe. The exhaust system must be free-flowing, and the number one most critical aspect of supersonic flow is every single one of the valve events must be optimal to be able to produce supersonic flow immediately upon exhaust valve opening, then continue through the scavenging cycle at the exhaust valve close position. Without optimal placement of the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, certain amount of overlap, optimal overlap triangle symmetry or asymmetry, exhaust valve closing position, and intake valve closing position. Without these valve events being optimal, supersonic flow will not occur upon the exhaust valve opening position through to the exhaust valve close position. And that's all the more I'm going to say about that for right now, other than supersonic flow absolutely does exist. I was personally able to achieve supersonic flow out of the exhaust of my relatively low 10.2 to 1 compression 383 small block Chevy I built back in 2021. The 383 has a fairly heavily ported and modified Dart Iron Eagle cylinder heads attached to a ported and modified Edelbrock Performer RPM intake. This engine breathes through a custom free-flowing exhaust that I personally designed and fabricated myself. The 383 that produced this supersonic phenomenon, surprisingly, is the engine in this big old dually we're in right now. Mind you, the 383 makes under 500 horsepower, with the emphasis being on max torque production, with strong power off idle and as much horsepower as I could squeeze out of the parts I had without messing with the RPM for torque production, all the while still producing a lot more torque than horsepower. So this engine is by no means a race engine, but this engine still made this damn near 6,000 pound dually with a 4-speed SM465 that shifts like a dump truck, run a 1328 at 104 miles an hour in the quarter mile. This engine has raw power off idle, but really comes alive from around 3,000 RPM up to peak torque at around 3,800 RPMs, then continues to carry torque. Once you get past peak torque, it starts making more horsepower. Then you can feel it start pulling harder as if there was a 25 to 30 horsepower Sneaky Pete shot of nitrous or a few pounds of boost from around 5,000 to 6,000 RPMs due to the supercharging effect brought about by the optimally calculated and modified pressure recovery dynamics of the convergent and divergent regions within the engine which are being influenced to produce the supersonic flow phenomenon via the complex gas dynamics produced via the dynamics of optimal valve event timing at full throttle. So now here's the proof for the supersonic flow. These are the slow motion shots of the supersonic flow phenomenon and the shockwave produced. I managed to record the supersonic flow event with my cell phone, so that unfortunately it wasn't caught by a high-speed camera, because I don't have one, but I slowed it down with the editing software so you can still clearly see the angle of the Mach cone, aka vapor cone, produced by the extremely high velocity, compressible flow of exhaust gases, going faster than the speed of sound as they come blasting out of my exhaust. Right as I hit wide open throttle, you will see a Mach cone, aka vapor cone, of compressible flow emerge from the pipe. Immediately after that, you will see a rapid pressure and temperature change from the compressible flow, which looks like an explosion. Then you will clearly see the air distortion from the shock waves rapidly expanding and blasting past the camera. These powerful shock waves from the Mach cone of compressible flow produced by the supersonic column of exhaust gases blasting out my exhaust had almost knocked over my cell phone tripod. So now the question is, how can optimal valve events be quantitatively achieved? Producing optimal valve events is achieved through starting with optimal lobe separation angle, optimal placement of overlap, proper degrees of overlap, and correctly influencing the shape of the overlap triangle via lobe separation angle, overlap, duration, lift, and even lobe profiles. When both lobe separation angle and overlap are appropriately or optimally selected for a given engine, said engine will produce the most pound-feet per cubic inch and potential horsepower across the entire curve that a given engine combination was set up to achieve. But if the LSA is not optimal, even being 2 to 6 degrees away of LSA too wide or even tighter than optimal LSA, in many cases, depending on the cubic inches and the output of the engine, will cost you between 20 and 80 pound-feet and 20 to 50 horsepower, and it will not produce the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM. Now conversely, if the cam was on an optimal lobe separation angle, depending on the cubic inches and general output of said engine, it would give you that potential 20 to 80 pound-feet increase and 20 to 50 horsepower increase over an incorrect or inoptimal lobe separation angle that is just 2 or 6 degrees away from optimal. The optimal LSA will once again ultimately increase torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range over any other lobe separation angle. The effects produced by optimal lobe separation angle are rather controversial, definitely not well understood, and in a lot of cases not even known to exist, or to some even be possible for that matter. Any controversy or doubt surrounding the subject of optimal lobe separation angle and overlap placement will end with this video. Now this brings us to our next data points, all of which are prime examples of the effect of the valve events, gas dynamics, and the increase in torque and horsepower produced across the entire curve by a camshaft with an optimal lobe separation angle and overlap placement. This data once again goes against the typical or conventional understanding of valve events and primarily the effects produced by changes in lobe separation angle. This engine right here was a 10-to-1 350 cubic inch small block Chevy with AFR 195cc heads with 202 intake valves, 1.6 exhaust valves, and 1.5 rockers. It also had a Victor Jr. single plane intake manifold and a 750 carb. Not exactly the combination of parts I would have chose, but anyway. This engine was tested with 5 cams on LSAs ranging from 114, 112, 110, 108, and 106. Each cam had 235 degrees intake duration at 50 thousandths and 240 degrees exhaust duration at 50 thousandths, with 500 thousandths lift on both the intake and exhaust. Now as you can clearly see, the cam on the 108 LSA, which is the orange line, made the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range, even more than the cam on the 106 LSA, which a vast majority of the industry's professionals, including Billy Godbold, hold the belief that the 106, or even a tighter LSA of say a 102, would have made a more torque and horsepower everywhere, but would have made less peak horsepower, along with horsepower and torque falling off first. For example, like the results produced by the 101 LSA, which is the blue line in this test, of a 10.5-to-1 406 cubic inch small block Chevy. Now notice the 101 made the most low RPM torque and horsepower, the most peak torque and mid-range horsepower, but at the top of the RPM range, it failed to make the most peak horsepower, and torque and horsepower actually fell off first. This is typical for an LSA that is what would be considered too tight. The 101 fell off first, because it opened the intake valve too soon, which resulted in flow not being presented to the cylinder at the correct time, which resulted in incomplete cylinder filling at higher RPM. At high RPM, when the intake valve's opening too soon, it ends up pulling more combustible charge out of the exhaust during the overlap period. This is called over-scavenging the cylinder. This is a result of incorrect placement of overlap due to the intake valve opening position. This in combination with too much overlap and the intake valve closing sooner, which also increases cylinder pressure and in turn evacuates the cylinder more rapidly because of the increase in expansion ratio, which then in turn acts on the intake harder, which further increases the amount of combustible intake charge being expelled out of the exhaust, which then results in a reduction in high RPM trapped volumetric efficiency. All of this, in turn, ends up reducing peak horsepower and the RPM at which peak horsepower is produced. This dyno sheet was just an example of the standard effects of random changes in LSA. You can get more information on that specific subject in my last cam video, which I highly recommend watching. Anyway, back to the effects of optimal valve events. So as you can clearly see, with the 108 LSA being optimal for this 10-to-1 350 cubic inch small block Chevy, it made 24 horsepower more at peak than the cam on the 112 LSA, and 21 horsepower more than the cam on the 114, just like I've been saying would happen. The common held majority amongst the vast majority of pros is that the 112 or the 114 would make more peak horsepower than the 108, which is obviously a very common misconception and is obviously not reality. Now also notice that 24 horsepower increase in peak horsepower from the 108 versus the 112 was from only a 4-degree change in LSA, which is a prime example of what I said earlier about a 1-degree change in LSA having a 500% greater effect on torque and horsepower production than just a 1-degree change in intake valve close position alone. You will not get that 24 horsepower increase from a 4-degree change in intake valve closing position alone in a combination like this. The statement I just made is clearly not just an opinion. Just like everything else I've said in this video, it's empirical and is absolute fact, being as what I've just said has been proven on the dyno thousands and thousands of times over and over again. Now to the calculation for the optimal 108 LSA for this 10-to-1 350 cubic inch small block Chevy with a 202 intake valve and a 1.5 rocker ratio. The cylinder heads on this engine had a low lift discharge coefficient below 0.75, so it uses the standard constant of 128. So the calculation would be 350 divided by 8 divided by 202 times 0.91, which will give us 19.709. Then we subtract that from 128 and we get a 108 LSA, which as you can clearly see is making the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range over all the other cams. Now since we're doing calculations, it's time to show that LS engines and small block Chevys share the 128 constant as I said earlier, but the constant may need to be adjusted for the use of LS3 heads due to them having at least a low lift discharge coefficient varying between 0.76 and 0.78. So now let's refer back to the 11.5-to-1 compression 408 cubic inch LS engine with 11-degree Pro Max LS3 cylinder heads. Now also note, as I've said in my other videos, this engine will require an adjustment for compression ratio, being as compression and expansion ratios are one of the most influential factors in the placement of valve event timing, overlap triangle, and optimal lobe separation angle. So now if we start with the 128 constant for this 408 cubic inch LS3 and adjust the constant for the discharge coefficient being over 0.75 because these 11-degree Pro Max LS3 cylinder heads have a discharge coefficient between 0.76 and 0.78. So we will increase the 128 to a 129 for the discharge coefficient. Now if we take 408 divided by 8 divided by 2.165 and times that by 0.91, that'll give us 21.436. Then we minus that from 129 and we get 107.5. Then as I have said in my other 2 cam videos, we add 1 degree for the 11.5 compression being 1 whole point of compression above 10.5, which equates to a 108.5 LSA, which just so happens to literally be the exact same LSA as the 108.5 238-259 cam that won Eric's Camshaft challenge. Need I say more? Now with that said, you could obviously use a plain 108 LSA. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a 108.5 to produce the power increase across the entire RPM range. Now next up, here's another example of another 400 plus cubic inch LS3 starting with the 128 constant. This dyno data is from a 10.5 to 1 402 cubic inch LS with CNC ported Chevrolet Performance LS3 cylinder heads. These of course have a 2.165 intake valve and also have a low lift flow discharge coefficient between 0.76 and 0.78. All the cams tested in this data had 232 degrees intake duration, 242 exhaust duration, and 624 thousandths lift on both the intake and exhaust. Now as you can clearly see once again that the cam on the 108 LSA being optimal, it's making the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range over both the cams on the 112 and the 120 LSAs, with about 18 horsepower more past peak. Now with that said, let's do the LSA calculation. So we start with the 128 constant, then we adjust the constant for the LS3 cylinder head's discharge coefficient being above 0.75. So now the constant is 129. So we take 402 divided by 8 divided by 2.165 times 0.91, which equals 21.121. Then we minus that from 129, which gives us 107.87. Then we round that up to 108, and bingo bango, we have the beginning of optimal valve event timing for this engine, as you can clearly see in this dyno data. Now since I've shown how to calculate the optimal lobe separation angle, we will have to make a few more calculations, and those calculations will start with either mine or DV's equation for duration. They both produce the same result, but mine is simplified, and unlike DV's, which is intended to do just overlap or total overlap and advertised duration, my equation does total overlap, advertised duration, overlap at 50 thousandths, and duration at 50 thousandths. My personal equation I created is LSA times 2 plus overlap equals duration. So for example, let's say we have a 108 LSA and we've determined that an engine needs 33 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths and 88 degrees overlap total. So we will go 108 times 2 equals 216 plus 33 degrees of overlap equals 249 degrees. That 249 degrees would be our intake and exhaust duration. Now we could simply keep it a single pattern camshaft that specs out 249, 249, or we could make it a dual pattern cam and say take 11 degrees from the 249 intake duration, so the intake duration would then be 238. Then we add that 11 degrees we took from the intake duration to the 249 on the exhaust duration, so now the exhaust duration is 260 degrees. So now we have a 238, 260 at 50 thousandths with that same 33 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths maintained. Now as I said earlier, we have determined we needed an 88 degrees overlap total to achieve the RPM range for a given cubic inch engine on this example. So then we go 108 times 2 equals 216 plus 88 degrees of overlap, and that'll give us 304 degrees. Now this gives us a 108 LSA 304 304 advertised, but since we're doing a split pattern camshaft, we will take that 304 on the intake and remove 11 degrees intake duration, so the intake duration is now 293 degrees, and now we add that 11 degrees from the intake duration to the 304 on the exhaust. Now the exhaust is 315 degrees. This gives us a 108 LSA 238 260 at 50 thousandths, 293 315 at 6 thousandths, while maintaining the 33 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths and the 88 degrees overlap total. Now note, with the duration being 238 260 at 50 and 293 315 at 6 thousandths, this combination of duration produces a hydraulic intensity on the intake and exhaust lobes of 55. You generally want to keep the lobe's hydraulic intensity between 50 and 55. And always keep in mind that the higher the intensity number, the more aggressive the lobe will be. So the hydraulic intensity of 50 would be less aggressive than 55. Rocker ratio would also come into play here for optimal valve motion, but that's a subject for a completely different video. Now also note, with this cam, let's say we've decided that it needs 4 degrees advance ground into the intake lobe, so the intake center line will be 104. Now for those of you who may be thinking, well, it's all about the valve events. What about the valve events? Well, just because you've managed to stick around so long through this video, now I'm going to show how I calculate every single valve event, along with the degrees of total overlap and overlap at 50 thousandths from the cam specs we just came up with, which I've never seen anybody else do on the internet. So to start with, we'll calculate the exhaust center line. The equation to calculate the exhaust center line is exhaust center line equals LSA plus LSA minus intake center line. So we will go 108 LSA minus 104 intake center line equals 4 degrees. Then we'll add that 4 degrees to the 108 LSA, which gives us the 112 exhaust center line. Now we're going to calculate the intake valve opening position. So we will take intake duration divided by 2 minus intake center line. So we will go 238 divided by 2 equals 119 minus 104 degree intake center line equals 15. This gives us an intake valve opening position of 15 degrees before top dead center. Next we will calculate the exhaust valve close position. Then we'll go exhaust duration divided by 2 minus exhaust center line. So we will go 260 divided by 2 equals 130 minus 112 equals 18. This gives us an exhaust valve close position of 18 degrees after top dead center. Now we're going to calculate the intake valve close position. So we go intake duration minus intake valve opening position, which is 15 degrees before top dead center, plus 180 equals 195. So we take 238 minus 195 equals 43 degrees. This gives us a intake valve close position of 43 degrees after bottom dead center. Now last we need to calculate the exhaust valve opening position. So we take the exhaust valve close position, which was 18 degrees after top dead center, plus 180, which gives us 198. Then we take exhaust duration, which was 260 minus 198 gives us 62. So we have an exhaust valve opening position of 62 degrees before bottom dead center. So the cam specs are 238, 260 at 50 thousandths, 293, 315 at 6 thousandths on a 108 LSA, and the lobes have a hydraulic intensity of 55. And the valve events we have calculated for this cam are intake valve opening position at 15 degrees before top dead center, exhaust valve close position 18 degrees after top dead center, intake valve close position of 43 degrees after bottom dead center, and an exhaust valve opening position of 62 degrees before bottom dead center. This cam also has an intake center line of 104 and an exhaust center line of 112. This cam was very close to the one I would have entered into the cam challenge had I had money. Now I'm going to show how to calculate overlap of the camshaft based off these cam specs. So we take intake duration plus exhaust duration. So that's 238 plus 260 equals 498 divided by 2 equals 249. Then we take 249 minus the 108 LSA times 2 equals 216. So 249 minus 216 equals 33 degrees of overlap at 50 thousandths. Then we do that again with advertised duration. So we go 293 plus 315 equals 608 divided by 2 equals 304 minus a 108 LSA times 2 equals 216. So 304 minus 216 equals 88 degrees of overlap. Now after all this dyno data, along with me showing and explaining all this information that isn't on the internet or anywhere else that I know of for that matter, all related to valve events, the empirical process of valve event timing starting with optimal LSA and overlap placement, and everything else that I've shown and explained, if you live in actual reality, there's no denying that valve events aren't the main focus in this process, no matter what anybody says or how their cognitively biased afflictions make them perceive it. If you are a professional and you don't have a full understanding of all the things that go way beyond the conventional university level or high level professional understanding of valve events, you have no room to speak on these matters. So you cannot begin to say these methods are incorrect just because you don't fully understand these methods, or if you don't even have a full high level understanding of the conventional methods of valve event timing in the first place. If this applies to you, then I will say you need to dig deep within yourself. Form some metacognitive function so you can check your cognitive biases and refer back to the unbiased independent dyno data I've presented that proves everything I've been saying in this video and in my last two videos. There's no denying the data for those that live in reality. Data, along with independent variables, are king when it comes to proving things to be empirical within actual reality. If you don't have empirical data along with the correct independent variables to go along with a specific subject to either prove or disprove something, don't speak on the empirical process of optimal valve event timing via optimal LSA and overlap placement, or valve event timing in general for that matter. So now we're staring in the face of reality, and the reality is that most of the mainstream camshaft industry may potentially know the standard effects of what they would consider a tight lobe separation angle, which according to the industry's pros would produce the most peak torque, make the most torque and horsepower below peak, but will always make less horsepower at peak, and torque and horsepower will always fall off sooner. They believe a wide LSA will produce less peak torque, less torque and horsepower below peak, but will make more horsepower at peak. Now, cam companies also use wide LSAs to help manage overlap and maintain idle quality while being able to use more duration, being as LSA has a greater effect on overlap because 1 degree of LSA will equate to 2 degree change in overlap, whereas 1 degree of duration will only increase overlap by 0.5 degree. LSA also does not dictate idle quality. Overlap is what dictates idle quality, RPM range, and vacuum production. As I have previously shown, you can have 2 different LSAs with the same amount of overlap in different duration. Now, the big misconception with LSA affecting idle quality is because if you compare 2 camshafts with the same duration but different lobe separation angles, the tighter LSA cam will inherently have more overlap than the camshaft with a wider LSA in the same amount of duration. Now, on the other hand, with 2 cams on different LSAs with equal degrees of overlap in different durations, the camshaft with a tighter LSA will produce more overall area within the overlap triangle for a given degrees of overlap, and the wider LSA camshaft will produce less overall area within the overlap triangle for an equal number of degrees of overlap. Now, being as the valve events achieved from selecting an optimal lobe separation angle will produce more power across the entire RPM range, both over a wider or a tighter lobe separation angle. As I have said, the effects produced by optimal LSA is not well understood, or in most cases not even known to exist, even amongst many of the top professionals in the camshaft industry, induction industry, and amongst a surprising amount of top professional engine builders. A lot of times, even a situation with an engine on a dyno, showing results produced by an optimal or near optimal lobe separation angle, they will be written off as a random occurrence or an anomalous situation, with their end thought process about the results produced being, "That's why we test these things." This thought process is typically brought about due to a lack of a thorough understanding of each individual valve event, their effects, and the influential factors of each individual valve event, which leads to the effects produced by optimal LSA being not well understood by many professionals. This is also due to a lack of specific thought processes, which leads to a lack of specific testing and data acquisition, which leads to a lack of specific empirical knowledge, empirical evidence, and experience. So needless to say, even as long as the V8 internal combustion engine has been around, optimal valve events without VVT has yet to be quantified, so to speak, by 99% of the population or more. And those top less than 1% of pros that do know ain't telling nobody their secrets. So contrary to the conventional mainstream popular belief, I have fully proven LSA is not just a result of the placement of valve events. Although technically LSA is a result of valve event placement, but that's just the most common, one-dimensional and simplest form of understanding, which is the most common thing you will hear people say when they're trying to express to you that they think they understand valve events, while at the same time trying to express to you that they think you don't. But in reality, most individuals can't ever accurately elaborate any further on the subject of valve event timing, let alone optimal valve event timing for that matter, because that very simple one-sided understanding of LSA being a result is all they have heard their whole life, or is something they may have heard somebody else say then just regurgitated what they heard. 99.8% of the individuals that regurgitate that phrase could not select optimal valve events by the degrees that the intake and exhaust valve opening and closing points take place, relative to the piston's position in the cylinder before top dead center, after top dead center, before bottom dead center, and after bottom dead center, along with the degrees of crankshaft rotation if their life depended on it. There's no way in the hell you could expect 98% of the population to be able to understand how to select valve events in that fashion, let alone optimal valve events in that fashion for that matter. Needless to say, I've seen this quite a few times. Now once again, in the reality we live in, optimal LSA and overlap placement has been empirically quantified, and it will produce the starting point for the optimal placement of the intake valve opening position, intake valve close position, and optimal overlap placement for the optimal timing of scavenging in the beginning of the induction cycle. The optimally timed intake valve opening position presenting flow to the cylinder at the optimal time, in turn with a given degrees of overlap, will directly communicate with the exhaust valve closing position in the overlap period, aka the scavenging cycle, with the exhaust valve closing position being the end of the scavenging cycle. The optimal placement of both the intake valve opening position and exhaust valve close position combined will in turn result in the optimal timing for the intake valve opening position to start the induction cycle to more efficiently fill the cylinder, while at the same time in the overlap period takes place optimal timing for efficient evacuation of the cylinder at the exhaust valve close position to create that low pressure delta upon expelling exhaust gases, which simultaneously aids in the induction system cylinder compressing potential of the optimally timed induction process by creating that pressure drop in the cylinder to more effectively fill the cylinder without over-scavenging combustible intake charge from the cylinder and expelling it out the exhaust. This is due to optimally timed placement of the intake valve opening position and the overlap placement. This allows the optimally timed intake valve opening position, overlap placement, exhaust valve close position, and matched ideal compression and expansion ratios, discharge coefficients, rocker ratios, and rod length to effectively and more completely fill and evacuate the cylinder, all of which enables the optimally placed intake valve close position to take advantage of an optimally filled cylinder, which increases volumetric efficiency at every RPM and creates more torque and horsepower across the entire curve every time. Now for those of you who made it through this entire video, thank you. And also I will acknowledge the fact and say that if you made it through this entire video and learned something from it, you obviously got something going on inside your head, and that's a good thing. We need more people like yourself in this world. So with that, I appreciate your time, and I will catch y'all later. So until next time, I'm Adam, this is CattleDogGarage&Racing. Take care everybody, and much love.